Wow. That's all I'm saying. Okay. This has low blood sugar.
Good evening and calling the meeting to order. Welcome to the West Hartford Public Schools Budget Workshop number 1. It is Wednesday. Let me get the date together. Wednesday, March the 15th, and so glad to be here. I will try to represent Charlotte well by doing the roll call. So I'll channel in Charlotte and Tammy as well. And so as I call your name, please acknowledge your presence. Dr. Jason Chang.
Present.
Ethan Goldman is excused. Dr. Gail Harris.
Present.
Dr. Renee Kamoff.
Present.
Claire Nessarella.
Present.
Dr. Ari Steinberg.
Here.
And Dr. Lorna Thomas Farquharson here. Thank you. Renee, may you lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance, please?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. So as we know, this is an opportunity for us to get more specifics as it relates to the budget that was presented to us at our last Board of Ed meeting. So with that, I will pass it to Dr. Andy Murrow.
Good evening. Thank you for joining us tonight for our first budget workshop summary. You all have in front of you our workshop summary documents, which I provided yesterday as well for your review prior to the meeting, and they will be available on the website this evening as well in case anyone else is interested. Our purpose tonight is to review the budget, but in a summary fashion. Rather than going through each page, we have done a summary for you that details staffing changes, program changes, and budgetary changes for each major section in the department. Or in the budget rather. And so we will have both Paul and Melissa explain any staffing and program changes, and then I'll go through budget changes. We're happy to answer questions as we go along, or if you prefer to wait till the end. Certainly we hope to have the answers to the questions you asked, but if not, we have another budget workshop summary in 2 weeks, and we can address any additional questions then.
Pardon me, Liz, I should have properly introduced you. You are instrumental to all of these numbers here. So Liz Hewitt, certainly want to acknowledge your presence. Thank you.
So I think we're going to start with our elementary budget for regular instruction.
Very good, and good evening, everyone. I'm going to highlight, so I'm looking on the summary page, and we're referring to pages in the board book of D4 and D5. And if you look there, the first change that you'll notice is in the number of classroom teachers. And so you see that from the adopted budget for 22-23 to the proposed budget, we're proposing a reduction of 3 sections at the elementary level. That reduction is in response to both enrollment declines and a slower return to our typical class size guidelines. We've been trying to step that out each year a little bit, getting closer to the guidelines as we move further away from the pandemic. There are 5 additional elementary classroom teachers that are budgeted under the ESSER grant, and that's a step down from what had been previously budgeted. So it's greater than a change of 3 overall is the point with that. Additional savings you see under magnet school teachers. We are proposing a reduction of 1 magnet school teacher, whereby we would combine the STEM specialist and the science teacher into, currently those are 2 separate roles, merge them into a single role, resulting in a 1.0 reduction overall. And then between the arts, physical education, and world language, you see a total of a 2.0 net reduction. That does not reflect any programmatic changes to those areas. It is a combined 1.0 change between music, PE, and art for elementary based on those reduced numbers of sections that we said. And with some retirements that we have, we haven't looked at instrumental music at the elementary throughout all of the reductions that we've seen over the last several years. So now that we have some retirements, we're able to kind of look more closely at those schedules, look at our efficiencies, and be able to maintain our programming with just fewer FTEs in that area.
And as we move on to the budget for elementary instruction, you can see each of our budget areas are divided into 3 categories: salaries, operating expense, and equipment. In every area, you'll see that salaries really are the primary driver of our budget. So for this particular section, our salaries are up just 0.5%. All of our salaries for 23-24 reflect contractual collective bargaining increases. In this case, it's also offset by a reduction in the positions, as Paul explained. And further, we have 6 paraprofessional staff that support our elementary schools that we're going to be able to utilize Title I grant funding for instead of general fund dollars, and so that reduction is reflected as well. As we look at both our operating and our equipment lines, the equipment line is consistent with the current year, and operating is just a very slight increase of 1% based on our anticipated need for supplies and then software at the elementary level. So happy to answer any questions before we move on to middle school, or we can certainly take them later as well, whatever you prefer. Claire?
It's not a big item, but I noticed there's test materials in other grade levels, but not elementary. Is the SBA covered in a different budget, or how are the testing materials covered for SBA?
So SBA, the Smarter Balanced Assessments, those are actually provided by the state of Connecticut, no cost to us. I do hold within the larger curriculum budget a testing line as well, where we will pay for things that the testing that does come at a charge for us at the elementary is typically our subscription to Ames Web, which is our literacy universal screening, as well as iReady, which is our mathematics universal screening, and iReady carries from grade K all the way through grade 8.
Any other questions? All right, please continue.
All right. If you want, the second page of the workshop summary references pages D20 and D21, which is regular instruction at the middle school. And here you can see some modest changes. We have, based on expected enrollment and the desired class size, we are seeing some slight reductions in staffing levels, both in the core academic areas where you see an overall reduction of 0.2, and in the unified arts, where you'll see, I'm showing make sure I'm reading this correctly, potential increase of 0.4 for a net increase of 0.2 in that area. Under the reading, we are looking at, again, through some scheduling efficiencies and looking at the class sizes, we are looking to reduce by 0.9 in reading, and we'll offset that with a merger of supervision of reading at a K-8 level. Currently, one of our reading specialists at the middle school level has some supervisory responsibilities for 6 through 8, and we'll be able to merge that with no loss of programming.
And from a budgetary standpoint, again, just some very straightforward changes. Our salaries actually show a reduction of 1.2%. Again, we have reflected contractual collective bargaining increases in that number, offset by the reductions that Paul talked about. It's also important to keep in mind that based upon the experience of teachers, the salaries can vary quite a bit. So sometimes, even though there isn't a large reduction in the number of positions, if we happen to have teachers filling certain roles who perhaps have less experience, that can impact our percentage increases as you look at those figures going forward. But again, nothing unusual in that area. Our operating expense and our equipment are really consistent with the prior year. But happy to answer any questions on middle school.
Questions, teammates? We're all set. Thank you.
Very good. Then moving on, we'll look at regular instruction at the high school level, and I will be referencing pages D38 and D39 in the larger budget book. Overall, our academic staffing is down 5.8 positions from the current year in response to a declining enrollment at the high school level. We've also adjusted our staffing ratio, the means by which we identify at this planning stage the number of high school FTEs that we'll need based on our number of students. And so with looking at the data over a number of years, it appears that a ratio of 17.2 students per full-time equivalency is most appropriate. So that factors in as the starting number for all of our high schools to kind of figure out where exactly those FTEs will be. Oh, and I apologize, I missed that one. The big change on this page is the library media specialist. As you may recall, we have had a vacant library media position all year at the high school level, only at one of our high schools, and based on our ability to operate efficiently this year and not seeing any change to our LMS programming, we've made the decision to eliminate that position in the budget for the coming year. So each of our high schools will be staffed with a 1.0 library as opposed to a 1.5.
And you see that reflected in the budget figures. Our salaries actually have an increase of 4.7%. One of the things that's a little counterintuitive on this page is that if we look at the adopted number of academic teachers for the current year, we had planned to have approximately 163. You can see we actually have 170 this year. And those were changes that were made, needs that arose subsequent to budget adoption. It was based on enrollments for classes and our continued desire to keep our class sizes a little bit smaller. So Paul had alluded to a staffing ratio of 17.2. We had dropped down to 17, which increased some teachers in the current year. As we go to next year, we'll go back to a 17.2, so that the budget actually, dollar-wise, is funding 1.2 more teachers than the current year. So a drop from the current year in number, a slight increase from what we had adopted. I hope that makes sense. It's a little up and down there. But an increase overall of 4.7, and then that's offset by the savings from the library media specialist. Operating expenses, again, very consistent with the prior year. Equipment is just a small reduction in the current year. We had purchased some science equipment at the high school level, and that's a non-recurring purchase, so we see that drop. High school is a little more involved. Were there additional questions on that? Yeah.
Yeah, I just had one question on this. Is the variance of $807,000, is that primarily also due to the changes in the contracts for teachers?
It is. So on page D38, the number you're seeing, 807, is comprised of several different factors. So it is the increase in the teachers' contracts offset by librarian salaries and then a small increase in our technical support salaries as well. But it's primarily driven by teacher salaries and the contracted rate increases. And the increase in staff of 1.2.
Right, okay. Well, 1.2 is not really that much.
So the average teacher salary, at least what we assume typically, is around 65 to 70,000. So of the 800,
yeah.
that's about 10% of the
10%.
increase.
And then I just have one follow-up question. On the budget that was adopted in 22-23 with 162.93, and then it went up to 169.95, which means that decision was made to hire more staff after that budget was closed. How does that work in terms of where does that funding then come, since that wasn't really part of our budget?
So what ends up happening is, we adopt the number based upon the enrollment that we are expecting at that time, as well as an assumed staffing level or a staff ratio that we do. As we look at our actual enrollments, not just overall, but for specific classes, we sometimes have a need to add a 0.2 teacher or 0.5 in science or social studies, and then it's incumbent upon us to balance that against other needs that we have. Certainly our primary concern is making sure we have enough teachers in the classroom to meet student requests, to meet class size guidelines, et cetera. And so then during the course of the year, I'm balancing that against other things that we may not be able to purchase that we had planned on, or based upon, new teachers coming in who perhaps their salaries are a little lower in the range, and we're able to offset that as well.
So the budget doesn't increase, you basically are just balancing that out.
Correct. We can't increase the budget unless we come back to you,
Right.
and that would also require action from the town council as well. So no, this is just a matter of balancing it based on current needs.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, and I'd reference, for instance, we have that open library media position that we didn't fill. We've had an administrative opening that we filled internally with another person and not backfilled against that. So there's other ways in which we can basically make up for that difference. I'm going to move. Oh, I apologize, Jason.
No, thank you. That was a great explanation. Thank you, Gail, for asking that. So I was wondering if you could give us a little more detail on the positions that were filled for the current year, and if there's any indication that those subjects or those classes would continue to be in flux, or was that a result of particular student interest in a certain field or AP course, for instance?
Sure, in terms of the delta from, say, the 162 to 169. So some of that will, I don't know if I can point it right down to the specific course, but I can certainly sort of give you a general explanation. Right now, our high school students, for instance, have just finished their course selection, and the department supervisors and the principal teams are getting together, and they have their target number for FTEs, and they're going to begin with sort of that large-scale picture of where they'll look at what are the number of course requests that you have, and then when and where do you make section breaks. Inevitably, as Liz has kind of alluded to, we can get some move-ins, we can get some late changes in course requests that will take something that's right at an edge, right at a tipping point, and increase it by a section and create that need for an additional 0.2 or a 0.4. I know that we had made a decision last year to not have the department supervisors for English and math teach, for instance, and backfilled some of that out of our ESSER funding. So all of these things, become decisions generally that are enrollment driven and maybe a late breaking change. And in certain cases, and I'll reference the new state curriculum for African American and Latinx studies, we get a course that if it didn't have the enrollment that we might have typically hoped for to be able to run a course, typically we'd like a course to have somewhere solidly in the range of 20, 22, 23 students, and those courses in their initial year have been averaging in and around 14. We can make a decision that, all right, we will grant you an additional 0.2 in order to be able to run that course, because we think that it's important to have that pathway, to have that experience available for students. Sometimes we'll be faced with that with a course that has 7, 8, or 9 students enrolled, and we have to make a hard decision that we're not able to fund that. It's just not a financially prudent decision. So all of these things kind of play out over the next couple of months and tell us whether or not we hit this projection. And when we don't, as Liz mentioned, we try very, very hard to stay as close to this as possible because it can get away from you quickly. But in cases where we can grant that extra 0.2, then we have to be able to realize savings by not doing something else that we had planned to do that year.
Yeah, thank you.
Please continue. Thank you.
So I will move us to the next page. Still is regular instruction, now system-wide, pages D70 and D71. And here we're looking at our gifted and talented program, our English as a second language program, school counselors, and we have a secretarial position listed. Overall, you can see that all the action is, in terms of any change, is happening within the gifted and talented. Looking at that line, we had adopted a budget of 9.1, and as we've discussed, when it got to scheduling and looking at being able to fit those people into their day across the multiple schools, we ended up needing a slight increase, and we operated at a 9.4. As we look forward this year and we're considering the efficiencies that we hope to be able to create with the new elementary schedule as we know it a year better, and also looking at the reduction across both the elementary and the middle school, we expect that we can staff that efficiently at 8.5, and there would be no change. I know that's been a question and some confusion out in the community, but there is no planned programmatic change to the delivery of services. We will be maintaining our Quest services in grades 4 and 5, and our Math Quest as described in the book in terms of their meeting hours. We just expect that we can work with scheduling efficiencies across our reduced enrollments to be able to provide that. So that is the major change on this page, and I'll turn it to Liz.
So with the ESOL teachers, is any of this covered by Title I? And of these areas, which are mandated?
Sorry. ESOL services, English as a Second Language, is obviously a mandated program. All of our students, as we get them in at the kindergarten level, will have a preliminary screening. It typically begins with a questionnaire to the home. We ask if there is another language that's other than English that's spoken in the home as the primary language, and that can signal, and certainly with kindergarten registration, when the teachers are meeting with children and they're doing an informal assessment of their oral speaking ability, they're kind of flagging kids if they need to have a secondary assessment that's going to tell whether or not they qualify for English language instruction services. It's actually Title III grant that helps support our English language learners, and we do have some additional staffing that we pay for through the Title III grant. It's primarily tutoring services, and then we also have some other opportunities, some enrichment opportunities for our English language learners. We have the Close-Up Washington trip that we do every other year at the high school level. We'll provide some resources potentially above and beyond our budget that are paid for that through that program. I don't know if that answered your question or if there was a follow-on.
It's just kind of confusing where you have the gifted, talented ESOL counselors and secretarial all in the same clump, but they're very different functions.
Sure. So it's really a function of how the budget itself is organized. So high school has its own separate budget page, and the principals, are responsible to deal with the staffing and the number of sections and all the rest. These are system-wide programs, so our counselors operate across all of our secondary schools and of course under ESSER, the elementary as well. Our gifted and talented program services K through 8, so that program isn't tied in specifically to to Bugme Elementary or one singular school. So we simply budget for that system-wide. And I think, fail to mention the, was the secretarial position here? Did I already, or is that coming up?
That's coming up.
That's coming up. Disregard.
And just to wrap up this page, the budget varies just a little bit in our salary line. Again, just our contractual rate increase with WHEA offset by 0.6 fewer positions compared to the budget that was adopted for the current year.
Moving on to supervision of instruction, referencing pages D80 and D81. We have a number of changes here on this page, so if you reference where you see the budget versus adopted, I'll talk through each one of those. Under the line for assistant principals, effective for next year, we're taking a hard look at the budget, and we've made a decision with Bristow Middle School and the fact that we have reduced the enrollment at Bristow over the last several years to make a commensurate reduction in the assistant principal position from full-time to a part-time position, and we will look to assign additional duties to that administrative position to realize savings in other areas. Department supervisor line, you see a modest increase of 0.20. That's not an actual change to the number of department supervisors, but historically we've budgeted for our arts supervisor to be teaching a class that historically had happened at the elementary level. With the new elementary schedule and realistically the number of responsibilities in that area, K through 12, we're simply now reflecting the fact that the visual arts supervisor is not programmed to teach. We see a 1.0 reduction on the next line down under teachers. Those are system-wide teachers, instructional math coaches specifically. We're not reducing the number of coaches. We're simply transferring that funder into ESSER for this year, which will net us one fewer position out of the general fund. And then finally, under non-certified staff, this reflects the secretarial position that's being eliminated from the front offices between our two high schools. One of our high schools was staffed at a higher ratio of people, higher number of people than the other, and this is just to create that parity.
So as we look at the dollar impact of those changes, certainly we first cover our contractual rate increase per our contracts, but then reflect the reduction of these 2.1 positions as out of the general fund, as Paul enumerated. In addition, we have 3 office paraprofessional positions that we are eliminating. One of the real focuses this year has been to look at any savings that we can achieve that doesn't directly affect the classroom, and so we really took quite a look at some of our administrative groups. As Paul said, we realized that there wasn't parity between our secretaries at the high school, and there are a couple of office paraprofessional positions as well that we feel that we can reduce. In addition, we have reduced the appropriation in the general fund for tutoring services. And we've done that really by taking a hard look at all of our grant funds, particularly since we still have one more year of ESSER funding. And we're really trying to optimize our grant funding and really maximize that to achieve some savings in the general fund. So you'll see that the salaries line is almost flat despite reflecting our contractual increases. As we look at our operating expense, again, a small increase, 1.5%, as it relates to instructional supplies overall, and then our copier rentals for all of our schools and central office. And when we look at equipment, we have a reduction, reflects a reduced appropriation at the high schools and central office, and really as a cost savings measure. We've taken a look at our enrollment. We allocate supply lines and spending at the high schools on a per pupil basis, and so we have reduced that as a way to affect a savings this year.
I have a question, please. I imagine with the summaries thus far, hearing first reference made to ESSER funding and how that is being used, and recognizing come next year, readily having access to ESSER funding will not be as it is. Any anticipation of how to extend the off-ramp, recognizing or trying to mitigate a severe budget cliff for next year?
So that's a great point. As we've brought on our ESSER funding, we've always known that it's for a limited duration. And so we've certainly used it to add positions that we felt we needed for learning recovery, learning acceleration, student mental health needs, as well as special instruction for our students. But we're trying to prevent a huge cliff. So in the current year, we have 37 or 38 positions covered by ESSER funding. When we get to that page, you'll see that we are reducing that by 11 positions, so we'll have 27 next year. Certainly, it's not half, but it is a significant step down. And then what we'll have to do during the upcoming year is really look at those positions, particularly some new ones that we have brought on that we didn't have in the past, and take a look at what we feel we can maintain going forward. I think there's agreement that they've all been very valuable to us, but it will then be incumbent upon us to really make those decisions and ultimately, put forth a recommendation to you so that you can decide which, if any, positions you want to include in our general fund budget going forward. Certainly, we'll also look at any opportunity to maximize other grant funds. We look at our Title I grant, our IDA grant, some of our larger grant funding, but at this point in time, we haven't been given any indication that ESSER is going to be extended, and so it will end September 30th, 2024.
Thank you.
I'm just curious, for the extra hires that we did over the past few years with ESSER funds, was that shared with the hirees that they were coming in with this extra support from federal funds, and no matter how amazing they were, we might not have the funds?
Yeah, so one of the things that I made sure to do with anyone in those predicaments, I guess you'd want to say, is that I met with them personally, one-on-one, and just made sure they understood what they were doing. Because we did have folks that left current jobs and districts to come here, and they understood it. And, you know, I think at the end of the day, they were willing to take that gamble in hopes that maybe there's some changes. And as we've had different retirements and things like that, that'll be something that we need to look at. But everyone that's in these positions has had a personal one-on-one meeting with me.
Yeah, I had a question on the assistant superintendent and the directors. And I think I'm reading this right, but it looks like you're only budgeting here for one assistant superintendent? Is that?
So we have two assistant superintendents. One is budgeted under the curriculum area, and the other one is
Okay,
budgeted under support services.
got it. Okay. And then just one other question. On the directors, which is directly below that, can you just tell me what are those two directors?
Sure. I believe it's Carrie Jones and Michelle Graveline, the Director of Elementary Education, Director of Secondary Education.
Okay, thank you.
All right, moving on to pupil services. There is a pupil services in your budget book, and I will be referencing pages E5 and E6. I know Dr. Morrow in his presentation last week shared a high-level overview of some key components, and I wanted to expand on that a little bit before I dive into the budget. Pupil services is a growing department here in West Hartford Public Schools. Our numbers are growing rapidly. And so just to give you an example, on our annual performance report in the 1920 school year, which is the last one the state has released to us, we had a 14% prevalence rate of students under IDEA that were eligible for services. We started this school year at a 16% prevalence rate, and we are currently at 17.6% prevalence rate just over the course of this year. And that equates to 1,629 current students. And so within our population of students that we're finding eligible, what we're seeing is a trend of more referrals to special education, which might be a result of the COVID pandemic. But we're also seeing families that move to West Hartford, particularly for their special education programming. So here in district, we pride ourselves on the programs that we're able to offer for our students, and we do have a continuum within our schools. So we have both intensive academic programming, intensive behavioral programming, and specialized programming from pre-K all the way through our post-secondary program, which you've heard about here at this table as well. So what you're going to see here is a very responsive response from the district to our student needs, because as our students move to district or are found eligible, we are responsive to those needs. So from the current adopted budget to our current year and then our projected budget, you'll see an increase. So over since our adopted budget, there was an increase of 3.3 certified teacher positions. And then we're anticipating, last year the board approved an intensive academic teacher at Duffy Elementary School. Again, within those trends, we're seeing students who have a higher level of need, and we use our intensive academic programming, which has a higher staff to student ratio and more specialized training for our teachers to service our students who require that level of complex programming. We anticipate those numbers to double for next year, and so we have put in another intensive academic teacher for next school year to service the students of which that have those needs. We're also looking at shifting our model a little bit. So there are two resource teachers. Resource teachers support students at their elementary schools, high schools, and middle schools where they are receiving either pull-out or push-in services for their academic learning needs. And we're looking to shift that by leveraging our teaching assistant positions that haven't been filled and to relook at our model and restructure so that we're providing more certified staff versus non-certified staff to really address those specialized learning needs of our students. Any questions? All right, Liz.
And the proposed budget that you see supports the program as Melissa described it. Certainly our salary line is covering our collective bargaining agreements as well as an increase of 6.3 positions over the adopted budget for the current year. The other line item you'll see that's increasing significantly is our operating expense, and in particular, that reflects out-of-district tuition for students. And Andy talked about this a little bit in his presentation, but just as a reminder, we have seen an increase in the number of students who are placed out of district to meet their educational needs, as well as we are seeing increased tuition rates, and then a cap on the reimbursement that we receive from the state. So India talked in his presentation that, our net cost per pupil right now is about $19,900. We start receiving reimbursement from the state once we hit 4.5 times that in expense. So it's not till we hit $90,000 per pupil that we start receiving a reimbursement for that student. When we do receive a reimbursement, we then receive 85% of the amount over the $90,000. So it's a significant cost, and we really see that going up. And so when you look at that and see an almost 15% increase in that line item, that's material. But as Melissa said, it's really responsive to the needs that our students have and to the cost of providing those services.
Sorry. So with the intensive ed program and some of the other strategies you're using, I guess we're hoping that we can reduce the number of outplacement students. The more we meet their needs or adapt to the changing needs of kids, the happier and the more successful they'll be within the system.
We feel very strongly that our students have a much better outcome when they're educated here in our public school system. We do have at times the need to place students out. What's not reflected in the number, which has been relatively stable, is the amount of fluctuation. And it's a story I'm actually very proud of. We have a department supervisor who works just with our out of districts. And one of her goals is to bring students back to district. It requires a lot of collaboration when we're moving a student from a more restrictive environment to a less restrictive environment and across settings to ensure their success. We have brought back a large number, double digits this school year, and we brought back somewhere around 15 last school year. So the numbers remain stable, but it's not that those students are the same students. And the students that we've brought back, best news story here is that they have stayed in district. So we have really worked hard to work closely with our out-of-district partners around unique programming and transition plans to ensure that whatever has led to their success in their environment outside of our public schools, that we're able to learn from that and bring them back successfully. And we have been doing so, and it is our goal and our mission to have more of our students back here in West Hartford Public Schools.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify, on the operating expense, is that only reflect outside tuition costs, or is there something else on that number?
So the total number is 7.6 million, almost all of it really, other than 50,000, that is tuition. It is. And so I think Andy had quoted some figures at the presentation that, this year we will pay tuition of approximately 12.7 million. We will receive reimbursement from the state of, I think it's about 4.5, and then the difference is our liability. So that's how we get to that 7.6.
With COVID and that the number of referrals, did you see a decline just because of how difficult it was to do the special ed referrals, and now an increase in a kind of catch up along with the impact of COVID?
I don't think we saw a decline. I think during the period of school closure, I think everybody was very understanding that each child was accessing their education differently. And when we came back, I think we really tried to allow time for our students to adjust. But we do have legal obligation for child find. And so when a child isn't responding or isn't meeting the academic rigor that we think they're capable of, or is falling below in a certain area, we do have a legal obligation to refer that child. and the PPT team has the obligation to determine if they're going to referral and whether or not that child requires specialized instruction. So we definitely have seen impact in our numbers from the COVID pandemic. We do believe that some of our speech numbers, for example, we have a lot of students with articulation needs. We'll talk more about related services on the next page, but there are some pieces to the pandemic that inherently impacted child development from a really early age and at each different benchmark for students.
Question, please. And so with referencing the reimbursement for out-of-placement being it doesn't kick in until 4 times the amount, and even at that, it's up in 4.5 times the amount. And even at that, it's only up to 85%. Now, this may be rhetorical or not, is that equation or formula separate from the education cost sharing formula?
It is. So the education cost sharing formula is separate, and those funds actually are received directly by the town to support education, but they don't come directly to us. The excess cost does come to us, and it offsets our cost to provide these particular services. The state had passed some legislation that originally had capped us at 70%, and they made a change this year, and so they set new tiers. But the tiers are set based upon the wealth of each municipality, as measured by the equalized net grand list, I believe it is. So based upon that, we are not at the top tier of reimbursement. In fact, I think we're at the lowest tier. It's 85, 88, and 90. And so it's by state legislation right now that is what our reimbursement will be.
So I don't think I'm speaking out of turn by saying that formula puts us at a disadvantage, as does the reimbursement for out-of-placement. Hence, reference made to legislatively speaking and advocating for
Exactly.
change.
And, you know, we certainly were very pleased that it increased from the 70% up to the 85, but certainly if we could get reimbursed at 100%, it would make a significant difference in our budget.
Oh my, pardon, when, was it 70%? Whoa.
It was.
Oh my. Okay.
So we're heading in the right direction, but not quite there yet. And one of the concerns we have is, you know, they passed legislation this year to bump it from the 70 to the 85, but we're not sure if it will stay at the 85. You know, I don't know if Andy can speak to that.
Well, no, and Liz did a great job on it, because it's really, the issue with it is it's never truly been ever set or established or funded. It was always, here's the pot of money that the state is allocating, everybody submit your cost. At the end of the year, we're going to go through and say, okay, well, there's $300 million worth of cost, we're funding it at $200 million, and so here's your percentage. Everyone gets it back. And so it was always a guess based on what we thought costs were going to be and what the issue was at the state. So it's never truly ever been established. And the concern now is they're saying, okay, well, you're going to be at this higher level of reimbursement, which is wonderful, but there's no commitment to that either continuing on for the next year, or there's no commitment to them actually funding it at a level that means that for us at 85%, that we're actually going to get 85% of what we submit. Because if they only fund it at 90%, we're going to get 85% of what 90% would have been. So again, it helps, but it's not the best.
Thank you for explaining. Yes, no, please. Gail and then Jason.
Can you just share in real numbers how many students we are sending out in this operating expense tuition?
That's listed on page B1 of the book. At the very beginning, it's 104 right now.
104. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the breakdown and the discussion over this. I wanted to ask, what caught my attention was when you were talking about the evaluation system using to identify needs. And I'm wondering if that diagnostic has changed over time. And in particular, I'm interested in how it accounts for neurodiversity, and if that is something that we're recognizing as a need for students that is a regular assessment that seems very easily trackable and fundable at the state level. Not something that would, that potentially would change for a student, but that this seems, that diagnostic seems like a really strong, kind of compelling number about what kind of cost education is for everyone in their districts. Is that it? So I guess the question is that diagnostic, has that changed over time in the district so that it actually catches more students more accurately, or is it that that we've simply had more students with more needs?
I think that's a really great question. I think it's a combination of both, to be quite frank with you. So there's been a number of key legislative changes over the past couple of years. Most notably, that impacts us the most in terms of eligibility is the classification of dyslexia was added in 2015 in Connecticut State Legislature. We're one of very few of the 50 states that actually identify under IDEA that dyslexia is separate and different from just a specific learning disability. So under our IDEA categories, it's not just a specific learning disability. A student can be found eligible with a specific learning disability as identified as dyslexia. And so over the past, I would say 10 years, maybe going back a little bit further, as legislation has come out and the need for child find for neurodiverse students, we've certainly acquired and invested here in West Hartford in very sensitive diagnostic and evaluative tools. So we do have a wide host of evaluations that we use to really provide a comprehensive evaluation, because we do want to make sure that when we come to the table and we're asking questions, we're asking the question about whether or not a child has a suspected disability first. That's our first question we're always asking. And then what domains we're assessing so that it's comprehensive. And then secondarily, we're asking if that child meets the criteria for eligibility under IDEA. So it is possible through our evaluation processes, which actually starts in the general education curriculum with universal screenings and monitoring tools before students usually come to the table for a PPT discussion, for us to really be able to meaningfully intervene in a proactive way and then develop instruction that's geared towards them. So it is possible that we also come to PPT with that information and find that a student does in fact have a disability, but that it might not be at the point where they need specialized instruction. So in those cases under 504, it's possible that students might be eligible under Section 504 for accommodations to access their education.
Thank you.
All right, moving on to pupil services related services, that will reference pages E21 and E22 in your budget book. So these are our related services that provide clinical support, such as our social workers and our psychologists, speech and language therapists, our physical therapists who provide gross motor support for our students, and occupational therapists who support our fine motor and sensory and sometimes feeding needs, and our teachers of the deaf and our interpreters, as well as our nursing. You'll see a common theme in response to the students' needs as our numbers have increased and our prevalence rate has increased. We both had an increase beyond our adopted budget of a 0.5 psychologist and a 0.4 physical therapist. And then we're looking at a projection of requesting 2 additional service providers, one a 1.0 speech and language pathologist, which goes towards that trend I was sharing with you earlier, that as students are coming in at the pre-K level in an elementary school, we're seeing an increase in speech and language development needs that require specially designed instruction. And we're also asking for a consideration of a 1.0 occupational therapist. These are district-wide positions that support our students across all levels and across all buildings. Any questions? Okay, pass it to Liz.
And to support those increases, you'll see that there is a proposed salary increase of $200,000 or 2.5%. You'll also see, consistent with our previous conversation, under operating expenses, we do have a slight increase relating to the cost of testing materials for Melissa's group.
In enrollment for pre-K, you had, I wasn't sure what the word meant, itinerant? What is that?
I could share. So when students enroll in pre-K, because pre-K is not mandated, students might be attending a community pre-K, but if they're eligible for special education services, we provide itinerant services such as speech and language. So students might come to us, or we might be going out into their community preschool to provide those services.
I have a question,
Go ahead,
just to
Jason.
follow up on the teacher of deaf and interpreters. I'm wondering about, just because my kids have gone through Charter Oak, where there's ASL is very common in many of the classrooms, and just finding out how much more effective it is to have not only the interpreter, but to have ASL be a part of instruction in the classroom itself. And I'm wondering, is there a way to kind of normalize that more broadly across the district? And if there's any kind of recruiting that can be done maybe on the teacher side, that if they also have ASL skills or certifications, that maybe that, not that we wouldn't need interpreters, but that it increases the effectiveness.
It's a very interesting question, Jason, and I'm very aware that Charter Oak has had, for everyone's knowledge, has had really an enrichment opportunity teaching ASL as part of during school and after school, outside of school hours programming, and it obviously enriches the environment overall, which I think is your point. Measuring the effectiveness is an interesting question, but I want to ponder that for a piece. But certainly in terms of the teacher recruitment, I would take opportunity to mention, as a district, we saw the value of ASL and recognized it as a formal language of study and had introduced it into our high school curriculum. We've recently expanded with your support. Over the years, we expanded that from a 1-year experience to a 2-year. Now it's a 3-year pathway, so that we do have for our high school students the opportunity for them to study up to 3 years of ASL. And it'll be interesting as we look at both the teaching assistant program that we have going on at the high school level, certainly our future educators diversity. We've had students that have wanted to go on and, I can't say in droves, but certainly I can talk with my high school principals and name a student at each school that has wanted to continue their study of American Sign Language. So we do recognize the value, but to your point, it is very challenging to find certified teachers. It's something that we've run into and something that will continue as the course itself grows more popular. That's just the nature of how our high school programs work. We'll build as many sections as we can support, presuming that we find the certified staff that can help teach those. And so we've run into that where the demand can sometimes exceed our capacity.
Great, thank you.
I'm just going to add to that. Thank you, Paul. We also find that there are very few higher education programs in our local area that are providing the certificate for teachers of the deaf and interpreters. So that, even for our special education department, has been hard when there's a vacancy to fill, to find that very specialized skill set. But we do see a high level of enrichment for our students who are immersed in our deaf culture. Claire?
Are there any online programs available that you know?
Not that I'm aware of, not for certification. I will say a big nod to that team. They are very highly qualified, and the certification for those programs, it has a really high bar. So there's different certificate levels, and I know it's quite rigorous. Okay, moving on to pupil services supervision. This corresponds with pages E33 and 34 in your budget workbook. You will see that there was one minor increase with a department supervisor who moved from a 0.8 to a 1.0 in response to meet the administrative needs of the department. And then we also converted a paraprofessional position to a secretarial position due to the increased workflow within the department to meet those needs.
And you can see that the budget for the pupil services supervision supports the 1.2 increase in FTEs. The other thing that is reflected here is Melissa's group has brought on more pupil services support positions. Just a little bit of a mouthful, but our best way of saying registered behavior technicians, language facilitators. They're grouped under the paraprofessionals, but with a different level of expertise and specialization to assist our students. And then we had talked previously about how Melissa is moving towards a model of more certified staff and reducing our teaching assistants, and this is where you will see the reduction of the teaching assistant appropriation is in this part of the budget. In addition, when you look at our operating expenses, we have an increase in professional services. That's really due to the volume and the cost of the independent evaluations that we have, consulting services, interpreters, physical therapy services as required by our students. Are there any questions on that area?
I think we're all set for now. Please continue.
So as we move to the next page, we'll now be looking at our general support services. In your book, this is pages F2 to F5. You'll see that we categorize these positions more by office. These are more either central office positions or positions such as our plant facilities department that is really supporting all of our schools. And so we look at that kind of on a departmental basis. You'll see from a staffing perspective, we are reducing one position. We have a vacant printer position in our print shop located here in Town Hall, and that position is being eliminated for the upcoming year. As we flip to the next page and look at the budget that supports all of our general support services, there are more changes in this area because this part of the budget really covers such a wide variety. So I will run through these, but again, please feel free to stop me and ask questions if need be. The salaries line reflects all of our contractual rate increases based on the various bargaining agreements that we have for all of these positions. In addition, we have tried to reallocate some of our funding. You can imagine that in this time of COVID, our custodial overtime really is something that we have seen an increase in. We have been backfilling that with some ESSER funding, but we won't be able to do that going forward. So this is part of our transition back to the general fund. We've increased that appropriation, but have been able to offset that with some temporary custodial cutbacks, as well as a reduction in our maintenance overtime appropriation. In addition, one of the items that is affecting our salary line, is an increase in our deferred comp appropriation, and that reflects higher participation in our hybrid pension plan for non-certified employees. We have a different plan provisions based upon when you were hired for non-certified. So as we hire people on, we're seeing more of an impact there. As we look at benefits, we have a large increase in our benefits. It's 8% for the upcoming year. The majority of that has to do with our premiums for our state partnership plan. We moved to the state partnership plan, I believe it was in 2019, and have been very happy with the plan. When we first moved over, I believe it was cost neutral, or we actually saved a bit. The first year we had an increase of 1%. The next year we actually had a reduction. And so overall, it has really been very beneficial to us. However, both last year and then this year, now that COVID is ending and people have kind of gone back to the doctors, have, put off things that didn't have to be done, elective procedures, we're seeing a really big increase in our medical costs. So at this point in time, the state is projecting an 8% increase. So that's what's included in the budget. We won't have final numbers until April or May, but this seems like a reasonable increase at this point in time.
Liz, may I ask one question
Yeah.
with that? So with that program, I thought that those who are enrolled, if there's certain requirements, checkups there to meet, and if they don't, then they're penalized.
They
So-
are.
So how is it that they're penalized and then there's also this increase?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So what it is that's called a HEP plan, a health enhancement program, and there are certain requirements that each participant is required to meet based upon your age, et cetera. If you don't meet those, there is an additional premium that the employee is responsible for paying directly. In addition to that, though, just the cost of doctors, prescriptions, et cetera, that the plan covers has increased, as well as utilization overall by our participants. And so that's increasing the premiums that we are charged on a per employee basis. When we went through our recent negotiations, we were able to increase the employee premium percentage for all of those. So that our employees also, are helping to cover the increased costs. However, it still ends up being a significant increase.
Thank you. Claire, yes.
Yeah, so the Family Services Liaison, could you speak a little to that? It looks like it was an additional in the 2021-22 year. And specifically, that's quite a critical position where I work in my school, and you have one person covering all the schools. Is that what?
Yeah.
It's on page F5, Family Services Liaison. Is that what that is?
Yes, so we have a Family Services Liaison that operates out of the Office of Equity Advancement. And that person does coordinate across, realistically, all 16 of our schools, working in conjunction with our Director of Equity Advancement and other individuals. We have support staff there that kind of shared between the town and us. In addition to that, under our ESSER funding, we do have a very similar position of a family liaison type person that's working specifically between Smith and Charter Oak, and we had identified that as schools that demonstrated typically higher need, that coordinate with families both inside of school hours and outside of school hours, helping them kind of manage the paperwork and get through things in order to enable their readiness to attend school, get through the registration process, work on insurance paperwork and things of that nature. And at those schools, it's a bilingual position.
I'm just curious. So families in crisis, families struggling, attendance issues, this person is covering that in all the schools,
Claire,
or are there other people?
I think it's important to note there are other people. I mean, do you want to talk
Yeah,
a little bit
yeah,
about the
yeah,
social
so
workers?
that's a great
Yeah, I mean,
question.
but
But
we
it's a
have a
key
full
position.
cadre of social workers as well.
Yes,
Okay.
so we actually, both through our regular funded budget, we have clinicians at every school, social workers at every school, depending on the size of the school, many social workers. And they do work with Shayna Gray, who's serving in this family liaison position. And she is a social worker by trade also. So they actually work collaboratively as a team. So oftentimes, like if a social worker at a particular school has exhausted resources, they might reach out to Shayna, who might have access to new or different resources to really help them network to connect families with the right community resources. But we do have social workers at all of our schools who do a lot of this outreach and family communication and partnership, as well as other clinicians like school psychologists. We also have, in addition to our board-funded positions, we also have ESSER-funded clinical team members that have been brought on. So lots of ways for us to connect and support families' needs, but this is an integral role in that, in particular, she is able to really navigate nuanced needs or very individualized needs that maybe families might be more comfortable speaking to somebody who's not school-based, based on their individualized situation.
Liz, I wanted to go back to something you said about the benefits. Do you have the ability, and I'm not sure you do because it's a state plan, right? We're just paying into a state plan. Is there any ability to negotiate any of this? Or it's...
No, so you're right, it is part of a
Mostly
state.
the health plan.
Exactly. And so when we look at the health plan, the state partnership plan is really a statewide plan. They have really a very good ability to negotiate because of their size and their number of members. So I feel like they are able to negotiate good rates with providers. So I do feel that we get good value. And I should have been a little more clear that the 8% increase, that's a statewide increase. That's not specific to West Hartford. Everyone's rates are going up that much. And because we're part of this plan, they're looking at the activity and the of the whole pool. So it certainly isn't a reflection that West Hartford employees are experiencing increased costs. We're part of the whole pool, and we pay premiums on a per person basis based on that. So no, we don't have the ability to directly negotiate, but I think prior to these kind of two COVID and post-COVID years, I think the increases that we have seen really are reflective of the negotiating ability that this plan has with providers. And then as we continue with benefits, the other items included in this grouping are, of course, our contribution for the town pension plan, which covers our non-certified employees, as well as Medicare and Social Security expenses for our teachers and then for all of our other employees as well. As we look at our operating costs, again, you'll see a pretty significant increase there of 11.3%. There are some large drivers, which I've listed here. First of all, we have our transportation costs. Andy had alluded to this in his presentation, but we do have increased contractual rates coming up for 23-24. Certainly our transportation companies are experiencing the same issues that we are as far as increased fuel costs, increased employee costs, et cetera. We're also seeing a greater demand for buses, particularly for students with special needs. And so we continually look at that and try to make sure that we're controlling costs as much as possible, but that is a driver for us in order to meet that mandated requirement. Our general insurance contribution is going up. The town handles insurance for us, and so they go out, they evaluate our risk, and then that risk and the cost of that is allocated based on number of employees, inherent risk of the schools versus the town, et cetera. And so they give us an allocation each year, and based upon the rates that they have received, our allocation did increase accordingly this year. The other thing that's driving this increase, and we're all seeing it personally as well, is utility costs. Our appropriation for heating is going up considerably, as is the cost of water through the MDC, as well as electricity delivery. We've talked a lot about conservation, and really our usage is not increasing significantly. We are still making every effort we can to conserve, but the rate increases really are driving our budget this year. As part of the WHEA contract, we do reimburse teachers for tuition, a set amount per teacher, and consistent with that contract, we have increased our appropriation by $10,000. And then the final item under operating is an increase in our contracted services. That's primarily for IT. They purchase all of our district-wide licensing agreements, and the cost of those continues to increase. As we look at equipment, which is our final category, we actually see a decrease in our equipment. It's not that we're purchasing less equipment or that the cost has gone down, but we're really placing a greater reliance on equipment that is funded by CNRE, which is our capital non-recurring expenditure account. That's part of our CIP. You may remember that in the current year, our appropriation for computer equipment is $350,000. That was scheduled to go up to $400,000 next year, so we made a corresponding reduction in the general fund. We still have to see kind of what happens with the town and if we receive that full appropriation, but certainly we've been in touch with the town manager and have explained how important that is to us. That funds all of our tech refresh at all of our schools, and so it really is a critical piece of funding for us. So he is aware of that, and I'm confident that that funding will come through. So that is what I have for general support services. As I said, that it's kind of a large grouping. It's dollar-wise a large amount, but covers a very wide range of activities. So I'm happy to answer any questions on that. Okay, so as we move along to our last section, this last section is our ESSER funding, and that's contained in your budget book in section H. H2 and H3 is where you see the summaries. So we received 3 rounds of ESSER funding. Round 1 ended last year. Round 2 will be fully expended by June 30th this year, although we do have till September if we still have some summer expenses that we need to cover. And then ESSER 3, we have 1 more year to spend that. So what you see here is a listing of all of our positions. Lorna, we had talked just a little bit earlier about our current staffing of 37 and how we're stepping down to 27. And I've actually listed the positions there because I want you to be able to see how we're using these funds. And really for 3 areas. It's, to focus on learning recovery and acceleration, to focus on those mental health needs of our students, and then specialized instruction needs of students. But as we move into the 24-25 budget, we will need to look at these positions and the related funding and really make some difficult decisions about how we want to be structured going forward. When we look at the funding piece of this, in the next year we'll have approximately $4 million that we will be spending. That's the final $4 million of our ESSER 3. You can see, 2.1 million of that is salaries with another 500,000 as benefits supporting those. So it's really, 2.7 million that we will need to either eliminate or to fund in a different way. When we look at some of our operating expenses and equipment, those are things that, custodial supplies that have been, and ventilation expenses, maintenance that's been higher during COVID, as well as some professional services that we have ramped up during this time. And then from an equipment standpoint, you may recall that as part of our ESSER grant, we are redoing our elementary school playgrounds. We are making some improvements to softball fields. So those will be complete. They're non-recurring, so that part of the ESSER will not be a concern. In addition, the current year is the last year of the subsidy for our pay-to-play fees. When you adopted the budget last year, we had talked about those phasing out. So as part of the budget adoption, we will be adopting the new rate for pay-to-play to go back to a rate that is not subsidized by ESSER funding. So that's what we have for ESSER. I know we've talked about ESSER kind of before in more detail, so I didn't put in a lot of detail here, but certainly happy to answer any questions that you may have about that funding and how it's being used.
Teammates, questions, comments? Yes, Gail.
I actually wanted to go back, if it's okay, can I go back to one other
Of
thing
course.
that you talked about? And Claire may have alluded to this somewhat, but when we talk about the, and actually this might be more for you, Melissa, we talk about the out of district tuition that we're paying, which is a huge number. Is there any possibility that we could, because we're spending such a large amount of money, take that money and actually provide the services in the district, or at least partially do that, so that we would maybe do a better job, and 2, kids could be within the district, and possibly there could be a savings there.
Sure, it's a really good question, Gail. It is very expensive, and we are seeing really exorbitant rate increases with our out of districts, coupled with the transportation costs. And as I said earlier, and I truly believe this, our students have the best outcomes when they're here with us in district. However, I will say that there are rare instances where students needs are beyond what we can offer in a public school setting, and that we really do rely on our continuum of services for those students. That might include students who are medically fragile, who have and require very specialized school environments with a very low stimulation ratio, or really highly skilled staff. We are really looking at, and I know Liz talked about it a little bit, in some of the contracted expenditures and some of the shifts under paraprofessionals. We are really making a concerted effort to make a staffing model change, where we are hiring more qualified staff who have higher levels of certification for that reason. The students that are participating in our intensive academic programming are receiving some of the best programming. And when we, as a PPT, decide that a student needs the next level of care, I will assure you that it's not because we haven't trained our staff, but it is something that we continue to look at and advance our programming. We look at curriculum for our intensivized programming, support services, and specialized training for our staff. But it is an area of focus, and it's something that we're really looking at because our number is high and we do want our students here in district.
It seems like it's only going to be going higher. Seems like it's only going to be going higher.
Yeah, and as I said, that 104, we've stayed stable all year, but not because there aren't kids going out. It's because we're really seeing kids come back. I wish the number was going down, but some students do need the next level of care. My hope and goal and what we message to families is we hope it's short term. And we have evidence over the last 2 years that we are able to bring students back successfully when it's planned and carefully scheduled. We do have students that are currently outplaced now that are making the transition back for next school year. So we're having those conversations. We've also started a process where myself, my department supervisor, and our BCBA are going to out-of-district program schools so we can see our students, we can see their programming, and better understand what unique programming aspects they might have that we don't currently offer in our public schools, or if there are structural or environmental scaffolds that we don't have. For example, some of our outplacement settings have a psychiatrist on staff, or have medical teams on staff, or have a one-on-one nurse for some of our students who have more involved medical needs. But we are actively visiting, seeing our students, seeing the placements, and trying to develop a really strong understanding of what is different and what can we be bringing back to district, because that is our goal. Yes, Ari?
And you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's a great idea in theory, Gail, but I think when we talk about budget, and most of our budget comes from salaries and staff, to create kind of an in-district outplacement type of school for 104 students, which would be the range of elementary to high school, I actually think to some extent the staffing and the salaries you would need to meet those needs for like a therapeutic day school within West Hartford Public Schools. I don't know if we did the math where that would kind of pan out, because it would still be year-to-year salaries, and so.
And I think that one of the things that's hard to tell is really the individual stories of each child that represents the 104. I mean, every situation is so unique of why students required that next level of care along the continuum. As I said, there are certain things that I think we wouldn't be able to do here in a public school setting that involve highly skilled nursing and medical teams and or psychiatric involvement for some of our students who do require very complex programming just so that they can stabilize enough to access some of their education. So we do have partners in the community who are able to provide that, but every student has a unique reason why they might require that next level of care. So for that reason, it'd be really hard to kind of share whether or not it would be or wouldn't be cost effective. But I will say that, we'll always continue to program for students' individual needs with the goal of always educating all of our students in the least restrictive environment, which would be here, which is our goal. And we do have, our intensivized programmings are essentially out-of-district placements within our public schools, and our teams are incredibly skilled and very good at what they do. And so we've really, over the past, I would say, 7 years, really advanced our teams. Training, our curriculums that we offer are cutting edge, and I really stand behind them. And we've actually seen students doing so well and responding so well that they're actually matriculating out of programming into the resource model, which again is our constant goal, not just to bring them back, but then to always continue to educate them in the least restrictive setting, which is, it's amazing to see. Claire?
So does your 104 include kids in the post-secondary up to 22?
So we do have some students, so across our continuum we have students that are out of district placed. Our post-secondary program within district is considered an in-district program, but there are students from the age of 18 to 22 that are outplaced.
Now, and I totally agree that in district is good and best for many kids. But my concern is sometimes for those kids, because after 22, the more time they get working in a mainstream environment, socializing in a mainstream environment, at 22 now they have the world and no more support in education other than private or DDS. So it's great that you're helping them acclimate back, because you want these individuals to head off into the world at 22 with a chance to interact. And we've seen huge changes among the school population of acceptance of these kids that are not your average kid, and the inclusion with the unified theater and unified sports. It's amazing to see how much they are included and brought back in. So there's definitely some great benefits to being in the public school, but yet there are times where the needs are too much for us to handle.
And, I will say we have an incredibly caring and inclusive community, and that doesn't live in my department. Pops and Jazz is running at Hall, and they did a sensory performance, and parents have been so thrilled and reaching out. And those things happen as part of our milieu. That is who our community is. They are very accepting and accommodating and inclusive of our students, and it's a really beautiful thing to see. But yes, we'll continue to program for our students individually. We do for all of our students that are going on in high school. We start talking about transition, believe it or not, before the age of 14. And so we're always talking about those independent transition life skills that our students need from the age of 14 all the way up until they either graduate or they age out as they turn 22. And we do have that conversation with parents really early, because parents want to be informed and should be informed about agency involvement, whether that's DDS or BRS or other employment services that their child might be eligible for. And in some cases, last year we had brought in speakers for our families around conservatorship and guardianship, because some families do need to consider the next level of support for their adult child as they leave our public school system.
Jason, yes.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. I'm wondering, how are our summer programs funded? And are summer programs included in this budget, or do they come from other grants and et cetera?
I'll start, and I know, Melissa, we each have a little piece of different summer programs. So starting at the elementary level, we have our Summer Connections program, which was historically in support of Smith and Charter Oak, and over the course of the pandemic, we expanded to all schools in the district, all elementary schools in the district. We supplemented the funding that we used to provide the traditional program under ESSER to support the expansion. And we are continuing that into year 3. There is recently, Liz and I were just talking this morning, there's a grant that's out there that would seek to continue to support summer programs moving forward for 2 more years. However, West Hartford doesn't qualify. It's based on how much ESSER money did you receive, and being a large district, we received too much. So we'll be on the lookout beyond next year to see what grants might be available to us if we're able to continue that expansion. We'll look certainly at our need and see if we want to, if we're going to return to our old model or find something in between. At the middle school level, to specifically support learning recovery, we did begin a summer program for our middle grades that is 100% funded under ESSER. We are planning to offer that again this summer, and funding dependent, because the ESSER money doesn't technically run out until September. We might be able to offer it one more time the following summer, and then again need to make a decision. We do obviously have our high school program, which is board funded and has been operating. However, we do make use of Title IV funding to help support tuition to the high school summer school program for students that may be operating under credit recovery, and we've historically supported students with financial need. So those are really the big three under my wheelhouse. I'll let Melissa talk about extended school year. Oh, one more, I'm sorry. We also have had our ESOL Summer Academy that is a town-funded program. We've had a modest increase to that post-pandemic that we've been able to support with some ESSER funds. And if we saw the need, I would imagine we could leverage our Title III funding if the number needed to increase. But that's been a historic town-funded program as well, and that services students in grades, current grades K through 8, so rising grades 1 through 9.
Cool.
And different than the summer school options you heard about through Pupil Services, students who are eligible under IDEA, when we come together for their annual review PBTs, we consider eligibility for something called extended school year. And that is truly what it is, and it's an extension of the school year for students who have challenges with regression recruitment or based on their profile require continued educational programming throughout the summer. And so our program historically has run 6 weeks, 4 days a week, starting before, it was like the last week in June, so I know it was before July 4th. Last year, we have about 400 students that attend that program. Last year, we had very poor attendance. And so we, after looking at data from the past 2 years, really determined that maybe making a shift to allow families more travel time and for vacations, for camps. Our students do participate in town-wide camps. So we transition our program to start after July 4th. So it'll be starting the second week in July this year, running 4 weeks, 5 days a week. And we're hoping that model will really encourage students to attend and take full advantage of that summer extended school year opportunity.
And that's board funded?
It is.
Yeah.
Where is that from?
It's held across 4 school sites because that program supports our pre-K through post-secondary students. So it's held at Whiting Lane Elementary School, Bristow, Conard High School, and Cogswell on the ASD campus.
So there's I'm just trying to understand a little bit more about the how much the budget reflects our ability to deliver summer programs, and it sounds like it's not very much. That it's mostly grant funded. Is that right?
No, I would actually say the opposite.
Oh, it's okay.
So historically, the board has funded the Summer Connections. We expanded that utilizing grant funds, but historically that's been something we funded. We had historically funded, obviously, the high school summer program. We supplement that, just a small amount of grant money to help with tuition costs. The ESOL program is almost exclusively board funded. We saw opportunity to do some expansion of number of sections and increase the offerings under, and we can continue to do that with Title III. It's really the middle school program. We had historically had, if I go back, I don't know, Andy, many years, we had historically had a middle school program and at one point made the decision to not continue it any longer. We brought that back specifically with the intent for learning and recovery. And so that's really the program, the only program that's exclusively grant funded at this point. And we have 2 more years to be able to utilize that.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Other questions or comments? All right, well, thank you very much for this information. A lot more to digest. We know we'll come together again for workshop number 2 in a couple of weeks, but until then, be safe and thank you so much, and we'll close out at 8:27.